Hello, everyone. Welcome to Growing Up in Science. This is, I guess, our third edition. It's great to have you all here. This is a series of conversations with professors about how they came to be where they are now. And we're very fortunate to have with us today Konrad Kording, who is the PIK, Penn Integrates Knowledge Professor in Bioengineering and Neuroscience. And I will not give further introduction because Konrad's about to do that himself. So without further ado, I'll turn that over to Konrad.
Great. Well, thanks for having me here. I wrote a little CV for today. It's not the standard CV I'm writing. And first, maybe as an introduction to what I'm going to tell about, there's like two stories that you can tell about my life. There is one story that the university usually tells. It's like everything's always awesome, like Lego movie style. And at some level, that story is real. You know? Like you can tell a perfect story of like Konrad's life as kind of a set of happy circumstances that were all like really, really great. You know, like at some level. And I should also say, like, I come from a very lucky position. Like a lot of things like were set up to be like easy. And so in the original version that I was gonna tell, I was first gonna tell you my easy CV and then my hard CV. And David convinces me that I should mix the two of them. But like, I've been very lucky in lots of ways, in like most imaginable ways, and I'm really grateful for that, and really feel blessed by that. But many things at the same time felt really hard, and so I wanted to like, through today, like, tell basically both stories of my life, of my scientific life, in an interleaved version. So, I was born as the son of a physics professor. And a chemistry teacher, and I'm a third-generation PhD student. So I grew up into that kind of a culture. It always felt natural. I could like swim in that in a way. But at the same time, when I was 6, I wasn't quite ready for school. So the teachers looked at me and said, that guy's not so bright. Let's better wait for a year because maybe he's going to be more mature next year. And then from age 7 at 7, they finally sent me to school. And at age 11 in Germany, you get tracked. So they send the bright people to gymnasium, and the people who should rather like do vocational things to like a middle track, and the people who should rather not get any more education into a lower track. And the teachers were pretty adamant that I shouldn't go to the gymnasium university track, but that I should do vocational school because I really wasn't that bright. Again, I get lucky. My parents basically said like, nonsense. We're going to send him to gymnasium track because he should get an education eventually. Or like a university education eventually. And then they sent me there. But like, that might have been a mistake because throughout school, I was a B student. Always. I was never among the strong students who get like A's or something. I get some A's and some B's, some C's. I usually pass things, but I wasn't good at school, and never did my homework. I hated it. It seemed nonsense. I couldn't relate to it. It just wasn't what I was interested in. I always had this problem, like if I can't get excited about things, I'm really useless at it. I'm not good at following instructions. And my math teacher also hated me. He like gave me bad grades. Like, okay, I was also obnoxious. I would like sometimes then when he did a mistake in a proof, I would go up to him and kind of prove that his proof was nonsense by proving that 1 is equal to 0 using the same logic that he just used. So I'm not saying he wasn't justified at it, but what I'm saying is like I had like a really like a hate relationship with my school throughout, and that continued as a student later on at university. So In particular, I was bad at statistics. I was really bad at statistics. I mean, I could do things, but I would be so slow because I would always derive it from the bottom up, and I almost flunked out of the final examination at school, where the statistics was randomly drawn as my topic. I was just absolutely horrible. Now, I'm kind of a stats professor now. So, but it's interesting, like, no, school didn't resonate with me at all, whereas like now statistics is the way I think. What else? But at the same time at school, I participated in all those national competitions. I had friends who were into competitions, and we went to like the national things in like math and coding and chemistry, just the first level at chemistry, but physics, and I placed as the best national like interdisciplinary project with 2 friends. Both of them are professors now, so at some level that worked well there. But like it's interesting, this contrast. Now, like at some level, clearly I was into science, but clearly I couldn't handle school. Then I met through that winning this interdisciplinary prize, I got into the National Merit Foundation. So the big benefit there is that you get to know lots of professors. Like they invite you to their homes. They like have like small groups of you over, and like you get to schmooze with them, and that's extremely useful. And they have these summer schools that are also great. You get to meet people and like take courses with them. So then I ended up studying physics, and I knew that at that point of time that was the right thing to study, because I've been hanging out with physics people for quite a while. Let me see. And then, do you think it helped? No, it didn't. I was like a B- student studying physics. Again, in parts as I couldn't focus on that one thing, I found like advanced math really interesting, and I found like the courses I was supposed to take really not so interesting, and therefore I was really bad at the things that I was supposed to be doing. I also was horrible at managing my time, so I remember that period where I was cramming for my final exam. I knew I only had like 2 weeks of time for like much more than 2 weeks of material, so it was like a haze. I was like working for 2 hours, then sleeping a few hours, then working again for a few hours, and it was basically going non-stop for a couple of days. I passed all my exams. I didn't get good grades, but again, it's like my love was like in trying to understand things. I didn't care about grades. Then after roughly a year and a half of studying physics, I got into biology, because I had friends taking similar courses that like showed me that biology was more interesting. And that is like essential, basically. There's like local network of students that I was lucky to be in this network. That is how I made all my good decisions in life. They basically, at some level, it's this network that you hook in, that like every one person might be totally clueless, but like by virtue of it being enough people that are really good, I think I made a lot of good decisions that I wouldn't have made by myself.
How are you able to, in university, really get to make friends who were in biology as a physics student?
So, I don't know. So when I studied physics, there was this group of people in the first row that all kind of didn't seem to care about physics, and they all ended up knowing one another pretty quickly. They were the people who asked questions, the people who kind of thought about things. And I don't know, like for me, getting to know people was relatively easy. I'm kind of very extroverted, and I think that helped. I kind of like, wherever I get to know my Uber drivers still. I like really know my Uber drivers. And I'm just like, hey, I'm Konrad. What are you doing? That is cool. Tell me about it. And I find people interesting. which is lucky in a way. You know, like it made it easy to get to know people that were studying at the same time. Look, I still have stuff on my CV. What do I have? Now, in Heidelberg, the physicist said, "You're a physicist. You should work in our particle accelerator." But I always worked as an assistant scientist. So I worked for a professor starting the first term where I did coding about like liquids in the water, and they did partial differential equations. And then I did cancer, and then I ended up in a neurobiology lab, still in Heidelberg. So I was always working for half a year for a professor and then move on. Which I still kind of have this mistake. I kind of get excited, really excited about something. And then a few years later, I'm like, okay, that was a really bad idea. Let's move on to something better. But that meant that I had seen a couple of different labs at that point of time. So I was in this developmental neurobiology lab. It was the best thing ever. Like you can, under the microscope, you can see how superior colliculus, how like the dendrites, they go like this, and then once they find the right place, they go like around the corner and like go down. And it's like so beautifully designed. So I saw that under the microscope. I was like, that must be described with partial differential equations.
Perhaps not everybody's first thought.
And then I went to basically, I hashed out like the first ideas. I found books, I found papers that like did that language, and I was really into it. And I found this developmental neurobiologist who was into it as well. And I went to the physicist. I'm like, look, this is gonna be my diploma thesis. This is gonna be so awesome. Like, finally, developmental neurobiology with proper PDEs. And the physicists would have none of it. So they were basically like, no, look, you're a physicist. You don't understand. We don't do that kind of stuff. And again, I got lucky. Basically, I was at the summer school that summer. I met that guy from Zurich, and he was like, yeah, no, we actually like biology as physicists in Zurich. And then I was all of a sudden, I was physicist in Zurich, and they were very happy with me being into it. They got me more like away from developmental biology into systems neuroscience, but they would let me, and that was big. But again, like, why was that possible? Because I was lucky to, like, through the right circumstances, to like know the right people who would then allow me to make that move. Let's see. Then I get the position there. Now, I want to tell you about getting positions. So most people are like, yeah, professors choose people based on the right skill set and so forth. That is like so not true. How do you get a position from a professor? You read their papers, their last handful of papers. You ask yourself, what's the obvious next paper, ideally with something that like carries the signature of what you've been doing in the past, and you propose that to them as a project. Like, dear Professor so-and-so, I've been delighted to read your papers, and I've been thinking that like with where I come from and what you've been doing, it would be so cool if we could do the following experiment. And what they will invariably do, kind of invite you and hire you as PhD student or postdoc. Like they have no choice. They will totally do it. If you manage to halfway guess what their next paper is, you will be hired there. And that's how we, in a way, get like the position there. Basically, I didn't know that it was a strategy then. It just felt natural, but like the emails were more or less like, hey, I read your like this paper and this paper and this paper, and this would be a cool thing. What about like, and I did that for a postdoc, and by the time I did my third postdoc, I had realized how I've been doing it, and then I looked at the statistics, and like pretty much anyone who ever did that to me, like was lab member later on as well. So I think there's a very clear pattern there. Again, like what does it? It helps a great deal to be able to take initiative. So And again, it's also it's a combination of initiative, luck, and just kind of not caring about social conventions. So there was this conference that I heard about. It was NICE, Neural Information Coding. I don't even know what this E stands for, but it was known in the field to be like that great conference. It was the big problem is it was professors only, invitation only, like small conference in Switzerland. But I knew about it, and I knew the person who was organizing it. So I sent him an email. I was like, I know I'm not invited, but like, hey, I was wondering, like, I'd really like to come to your conference. And he said, like, sorry, this invitation only. Then I emailed again, like a month later. I was like, I hear that some people can't make it to your workshop. Do you think you'd have a spot for me? And like after I then emailed once more, he was like, okay, in God's name, look, like if you promise to not email me again, you can come. And at that conference is where I then met the people that later on that would characterize my field, which is all the guys who jointly organized COSA in the conference. That is Tony Zader and Zach Mainen and like all those guys. And I knew of them, and I wanted to know them, and I was basically stalking them until they started talking with me. Now, stalking someone's like totally, you go to prison for it, and you deserve it. But stalking a professor is like totally fair game, like at conferences. And that means that, yeah, I would hang out in the lobby of conferences and basically wait for the right professor. And that is fine. It's morally not reprehensible. In fact, it's people make their jokes about it. It's called the lobby game. And as soon as a bigger professor comes in, everyone leaves that professor and goes to the next one. You actually want to be playing that game. It's a good one. But also, like, while doing my PhD, I was rejected at all summer schools. They have there's all these summer schools. They're awesome, great professors, great everything. I would apply, and they would always reject me. But yeah, like that felt bad. Not like it was like all those rejections for that. Also, my first paper got rejected. My professor loved it. He was like, yeah, we're going to send it to Nature. And to Nature, we did send it. And of course, Nature rejected it. And Science rejected it. And PNAS rejected it. And Journal of Neuroscience rejected it. And Neon rejected it. And basically, it was like 7, 8 journals that rejected it. It went through 150 iteration. It was horribly written. Now that I read it, it's really embarrassing. But it was really bad at writing. And writing is something that I think I learned much later in my career. I learned sitting next to Daniel Walpert, my later postdoc supervisor in London. That's how I learned to write. I made absolutely no progress as a writer during my PhD. Good. Fun little story. We often cooked at night. So there were at the institute where I was. There were a couple of people. They occasionally worked like long in the evening, and there was a kitchen in the place. And well, one day the sauce for the pasta, I was really into coding. I had put the sauce onto the stove, and then the alarms went off, and the emergency services came to stop the apparent fire from the kitchen. And people looked really angry. The leaders of the institute looked really angry at me afterwards. What else? I did live. When I was an undergraduate student. Zurich is very expensive, so I was kind of broke all the time. So I lived in the house of a 100-year-old math professor for $200 a month for helping him in the garden at times. And in the end, it was kind of good because I heard a lot of stories about old things that old famous math professors talk about. What else? I'm kind of running out of things.
So you should all see how many 100-year-old math professors there are at Penn.
Yeah, and which ones need help in their home.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. Halfway through, I want to also share a little how the feeling of things changed. So when I started, I thought my professor really knew everything. he was working binding by synchrony, and it seemed that this was the answer to consciousness and all kinds of other problems. Like halfway through my PhD, I learned that he really didn't understand what he was doing. And then towards the end of my PhD, I realized that even the department leaders didn't know what they were doing. And it took me about a few years into the postdoc until I realized that no one I ever worked with really knew what they were doing. And by the time I was like mid-assistant professor, I kind of had realized that like maybe no one really who's in science knows what they're doing. Like not really, like not like we know the dance, we know how the pieces work, but like where we're going with it, we're always very unsure. Now, after my PhD, okay, I needed to do a postdoc. How to decide how to do a postdoc? How do I decide where to go for a postdoc? Well, I asked all my friends and all the professors that I know, and they kind of all pointed to London. They were like, Daniel Walpert, he's like really new, but like he's young and he's gonna be a star. And Daniel Walpert was on the way, he kind of was a star, and he was definitely on the way to be a big star. And when I joined him, there were only 3 people in his lab, me and like two others. And it was great because he had time for me, and we wrote lots of cool papers together. Then, what else? I had a girlfriend in Germany when I was a postdoc. I was postdoc in London. She was like studying to be a judge. And I really wanted back to Germany. I wanted to get to be professor in Germany, do my years in London, and then go back. And no one in Germany had the slightest interest in me. 0 talk invitations, nothing. And then like that relationship didn't last. And I later met my wife like a year later or something. And as soon as I no longer had any interest in going to Germany, because she's French, and so like Germany just doesn't sound all that attractive. Since then, Germany really likes me. Now it's like, why like that? Life could have done it differently, but that is and this is at some level one of the annoying things as a scientist. No, you are not free to be where you want to be. And you'll see that theme come up like a few times in the remaining quarter page. So then, in any case, how did it continue? Oh yeah, also like let's have a few more embarrassing things. So when I was a postdoc then in London, I realized that neural networks were a really, really bad idea. Machine learning was beautiful, and neural networks was clearly the wrong idea that we had overcome by then. And by now, much of what my lab does is deep learning. It's neural networks. But back then, it seemed absolutely clear, and I could have given you very, very good reasons why neural networks are never going to be a thing again. And it just shows how one is wrong, like all the time. Now, then, as I told you in London, I met my now wife, and she had a postdoc. She had like a visiting position at Harvard, and so after we've been together like a month and a half, it was like, okay, look, like she's leaving for Harvard. So I was like, oh my God, I've got to go to Boston. So I asked around in London, basically, guys, everyone that I know, like, what should I do in Boston? And people again pointed to Josh Tenenbaum. It's like, look, Josh Tenenbaum is going to be really like big thing in the future. And Josh Tenenbaum was going to be a big thing in the future. So after everyone said you should work with Josh, I basically called Josh, told him, what did I tell him? What his next paper was going to be. I mean, like, okay, my best guess of what his next paper was going to be. It had a little bit of Konrad flavor, but it was still what obviously was Josh Tenenbaum's next paper. And Josh was like, that is kind of cool, I must hire you. And which she did. Okay, in any case, so I followed my wife there. Like 2 years later, we go into the job market. Now there's a problem. No? Two professor people who want to be professor, they need to be at one place. So it was really difficult. In fact, I went first after 1 year. Lots of places interviewed me. um, and they all rejected me. They were basically, you're not our candidate. And so then the second year, like my wife and me went at the same time. And we really both only get one offer. Both of them from Chicago, independent, which was incredibly lucky if you think about it. But it was great. Now, let me mention one more thing how I've been lucky. I entered a whole bunch of fields, and I always entered them at the time where the field was about to take off. That makes your life so much better, because that way, whatever you do, basically the general momentum of the field makes it much easier for you to make a name for yourself. It was during my late PhD, statistics of natural scenes, Bayesian statistics later, mobile diagnostics later, and now a kind of deep learning brain connection is taking off. The lab's very active in that area. But I get very lucky that at some level UPenn was looking for someone like me at that time. In fact, before I even found out that we needed to move, like we had like started talking a little bit, and that's how I got here. But again, I was very lucky, and it could have been worse. Now, once I was professor, what else? I get my first 23 grants rejected in a row. I submit a grant, rejection back. I go to my chairman, they rejected my grant. And chairman was like, yeah, little one, it's gonna be fine. And I come into his office 23 times, kind of over the course of 3 years. And then more or less my NIH program officer that I started, not like I talked a lot with those guys. I want to learn, like how do you write grants that get funded? And I think at some point of time it was just like he couldn't stand having to reject my grants anymore. So I get kind of very lucky, funded at a relatively mediocre score. And since then, I've been really lucky, like really good at grant writing. Most of my grants get rejected these days, get accepted these days. But that was very hard. It felt really hopeless after 23 grants. But at some level, I get angry and I kept writing my grants and eventually I got it. And now, well, here's the last item. Now I become incompetent. Now, like I'm full professor with all kinds of things. My whole lab switched to Python. I'm really good at MATLAB programming. But like half the people, everyone who's in my lab is better than me at coding. So at some level, I don't yet know how to manage that. I'm becoming incompetent at part of what I do as professor, which is coding. And that is my like 2 CVs, like the easy CV, like Konrad's lucky, and the hard CV, things really feel very hard along the way, like mixed.
That's awesome. Thank you, Konrad. So I'll turn it over to questions in a moment. I just wanted to warm up with a couple. And I think the first thing I'd like to ask is, you mentioned many situations where it was, you had a wall in front of you and you kept on driving into the wall, and then eventually the wall disappeared or got a little bit lower. How did you know to keep driving into that wall? And how did you change your approach? What gave you the ability to keep on doing that? Because I think many of us have had that experience, possibly without the wall breaking.
I don't know. You see, I don't know how often the wall didn't break. I don't know. There's just something about science that I really, really care about and that I love. And that's really exciting. And at some level, it never felt like I had a real choice. It always felt like I would be letting myself down if I didn't pursue science. And therefore, I don't think I ever had. No, like, look, if my livelihood or my family's livelihood had been on the line, that would have been different. But like, as long as that's not like that, for me, yeah, it's kind of, I had to do it.
Do you think that that's necessary to have gotten, like, there are many people in science who probably wouldn't say that that was their approach, and that that was how they felt about their work. There may be people who are less excited.
It's not necessary. Not like there are people, well, I don't know.
That's fine.
But I think
you don't have to solve the entirety of science this afternoon.
Yeah, but I think there's a real thing that science sometimes leaves you in hard situations that a non-scientific career wouldn't. At the same, and that's something that we need to balance based on how we feel about it. At the same time, like, most days are just great. I work with amazing people. I work with people who are much better than me at coding, and I work with, it's great fun for me. But even on the days where it felt like I'm running against the wall, I felt angry. I didn't feel defeated. I mean, like, I felt a little bit defeated, but I felt more angry than I felt defeated. And that's better feeling than the hopelessness that comes otherwise.
Yeah. Maybe this can help the rest of us when we're choosing whether to feel defeated or angry.
The reviewers are wrong. Just memorize that. They reject your paper or your grant, they are wrong. It's not that your grant has been bad. And in fact, since then we've been doing a lot of statistics of science of science, and a lot of it is just random. It's just super strong random component. Get the same paper or grant, give it to a bunch of people. They will wildly disagree what's good research and what isn't. So a lot of it is just, maybe it just requires you to put in 23 grants. But you learn as part of that.
Yeah, so you're saying that the excitement is what gives you the ability to persist for long enough that you can overcome the randomness.
I think so, yeah. For me at least.
Audience questions?
So as a follow-up question on that, when do you realize when to drop it? That, okay, I should stop now.
The question was, when do you realize, when did you realize when to drop it?
Yes.
In some cases, if you have to stop persisting.
Against the wall, and it's you, sometimes you're like, I'm going to keep going until I succeed, and sometimes you realize, okay, now it's time to drop it.
Yeah, so I'm a fast dropper. I like to, I like to have multiple ideas that I work on at the same time. And sometimes an idea looks better ex ante than it does later. In which case, I tend to always publish the things, but there is this, okay, this idea wasn't great, let's get it out. And then we publish what we found so that someone else doesn't go down that same route. But basically, once like it feels like an idea isn't that great anymore, I think it's time to move on. And because the distribution, look, if I look at projects and I push people away from that very much in my lab, but projects, people in other labs, there are people who work on half-a-year projects that lead to great papers. And there are people who work on 8-year projects that lead to horrible papers. So at some level, it's like an exponential distribution or something. You know, like basically the fastest projects can be very fast, and the slowest projects can be really slow. And the slowest projects aren't necessarily better. And the effect is that I think a lot of science is powered by the sunk cost fallacy. We worked with that monkey for 3 years, therefore there must be an important paper in here. And I always try and push people in my lab and in friendly labs out of those situations. It's basically just because you spent 3 years on it does not make it one bit more probable that this will be an important paper than if you had just started it. And that like consciously overcoming biases, I think that is another important thing. And in particular, the sunk cost fallacy. It's so easy in science to get sucked into it. A lot of professors, they've been working on some theory. The world moves on, that theory is no longer so hot. But the person spent half their year working on that theory. How could they abandon that theory? Well, their life and science would be better off if they said, okay, look, that theory had something to contribute. Now there's other theories that have something to contribute. So I think if in doubt, we should drop. We shouldn't just drop it and move on. We should like publish what we learned so far and then move on to the next paper.
You mentioned that during your PhD you kind of realized that people didn't know what they were doing in science very much.
Yeah.
What would you say is the problem in the way we're doing neuroscience today, and how did that lead you to an interest in causality?
Well, this is a loaded question. So as you know, I'm interested in brains, and right now I'm interested in the idea of causality. So how can we find out if one thing makes another thing happen? And but the question had many layers. So how did I get there? At some level, so when I was a PhD student, I found that the logic of the experiments that I was working on couldn't really support the kind of claims that we wanted to make. The claim that we wanted to make is that if parts in the brain synchronize with one another, that is what makes them be an entity for us. So it's the so-called binding by synchrony hypothesis. But the data that we had couldn't really ask that question. It's a causal question. Now, does the brain know that these things belong together because they're synchronized? Or is it that because they belong together, they synchronize? We couldn't know that one. And so the logic was problematic back then. And so it was kind of in the back of my mind then, but I wasn't very clear about it. So over time, and when they said, I found out that they don't know what they're doing, people make arguments that seem to be wrong. And like I dig into the argument and I find a place where it's like, okay, how do you get from A to B? And like I could see that like that argument didn't work. That argument is often of a causal nature. They basically say one thing makes another thing, two things are correlated, therefore one thing makes another thing happen. And no, and as neuroscientists, if someone asks us, what does it mean for you to understand the brain? The answer that I typically will get is, I want to understand how like this brain area affects this brain area, which ultimately affects behavior, or how this neuron affects this neuron, which ultimately affects behavior. That is the typical answer that I get when I ask people. And that logic is not supported by the kind of experiments that we did. And we've written a number of papers in that area for people in the audience that are interested in. So by now, basically, this worry deep down that like no one really knows what they're going to, we can now put math on it and like be very clear about what that means.
No questions.
I have two questions. First question is, you said that there were times when you used to fail in a particular task, like writing a 23 marks. So how do you actually get over that failure and move on and start working harder to the next step? Because sometimes it really pulls you down, right? Or like how you fail in like summer school or something like that.
Yeah, so at some level, now there can be two feelings that you can have. I give you a grant, or like I give you something. I give you my paper, and you're like, horrible. At some level, my natural reaction is anger towards that. I'm like, how can he see this paper is horrible, given how awesome the idea is that I know that I put in there? And that switch from defeat to anger, I think that certainly helps me a lot. Because it's like, okay, I'm going to prove to him that this is a good idea. Now, if he rejects my paper, I'm going to write it up even nicer and like show him that he should have understood it the
Don't
first time I
think
submitted
that
it.
it's a good idea. What if you've come in the interim to think that there are weaknesses in your own idea?
Oh, yeah, that happens too. But no, if the other thing is that it's like, yeah, cool, that's something I can fix. No, that's the other one. That's the more positive one. For me, it was always a mixture. No? Like sometimes, and sometimes both, where I'm like, okay, that's a great idea, they could have seen it, but like, I really should have written that differently. And the other thing is, yeah, like at some level, the excitement for ideas for me always weighed much more strongly than the locally putting it down. Like, sure, locally, like, yeah, it doesn't feel good to get a rejection. Still doesn't. I still get rejections. But like, hey, to me, this is incredibly exciting. So at some level, yeah, it's just like part of the game, I guess. It just doesn't. No, at some level, I'm in it because I'm into it, and that's something that like no bad outcome can take away from you. It's like it is awesome, that insight, and like over time, there's like so many things where I'm like, oh my God, that is so cool. That insight alone is kind of making the whole endeavor worth it.
So I want to ask a question that maybe many in the audience have been waiting to hear the answer to. What happened in Lithuania?
Okay, so I was kind of overwhelmed as a PhD student. I was working on lots of projects at the same time. I was like supervising some young students, and so there was this NATO co-sponsored conference in Lithuania, and I did know which day it was. I forgot which month it was. It was like June or July or something, 2 months that sounded similar. So I booked a flight. I flew there. I took a bus. It was at the seaside resort. I show up at the conference hotel and check in, and they said like, sorry, we don't have you on the list. And after some additional asking, they realized it was there a month ahead of time. And yeah, that was kind of shocking.
Did you stay there for a month?
I did not stay there for a month. I took the next possible bus back to the capital and flew back and cried for a day or so. From now, it seems like a real fun episode. It didn't feel so fun back then.
Did you end up going to the conference a month
I
later?
did go to the conference, and it was great. And there are people that we're now talking about collaborating that were at that conference, and I talked with them ever since. So it was worth coming again, but the first time was a little difficult.
I guess the moral of the story is you should go a month early rather than a month late.
I guess so, yeah.
Did you tell the people at the conference when you arrived?
Oh, you bet that everyone knew about it. Like Tony, no, Tony Zado is still like occasionally joking about it. Yeah.
So it was really interesting hearing about how you weren't so good at school, and through the process you were still very engaged. It's just that you were engaged in the things that you liked, as opposed to the things that were just required of you. And I was just wondering, based off of your general experience, how does that color your approach to mentorship?
Yeah, I think it's very similar. So as you may have seen, my mentorship approach is very much, I try to figure out for everyone in the lab what's like their fit, what's this thing that they get excited about. And then I try to encourage them like along that route. So I'm trying to kind of find the things that people aren't supposed to do, but the things that kind of, that really captures their imagination. I hope I usually succeed at finding that. And for some people in the lab, like I don't want to mention anyone, but like I had someone who kind of spent a lot of time in the lab and kind of didn't write papers, and then once we found like the thing that like I always knew, but I didn't know projects in that area that like they were really excited about, they started being very productive, and I've seen that multiple times. And so I deeply believe in fit. So I like it's weird to interview him with me. I think like most people interview like multiple phone calls, and it's like, hey, what do you find exciting? And they're like, why are you asking me? Which job do you want solved? And I'm like, no, tell me what's cool in the world. Tell me the ideas that are big for you. And so I think it very much colors my view. And I'm therefore worried if people who like operate differently, like how I can be a good mentor to them.
So you've spoken a few times about the importance of having many irons in the fire. So if one thing doesn't work out, you can just switch to something else. In theory, I would love to do that, but that's so hard to do, because like just shifting focus, especially when you're leading multiple things. So do you have any tips on working on multiple projects that are not immediately related?
Yeah. So there's multiple reasons why it's useful to have multiple of them. The first one is a lot of projects will run into blockers. Like you run stuff and your code takes 3 days to run. Now, what are you going to do in those 3 days? So if you just have one project, you're basically forced to like do whatever. So those blockages, in a way, are what makes it necessary, in my view, to have multiple projects. The second one is many times you run, you collaborate. In fact, most people in my lab run collaborations. In that case, the collaborators are the blockages. And then the brain gives you certain blockages, which is like there's certain times where you don't know what the next thing is, how to advance it. And you need some distance because you're so close, you've been coding this thing all the time. You kind of like lose your sense of perspective. So shifting then gives you an advantage there. So therefore, my general recommendation is to always run at least 2 projects. But yes, there's a switching cost. So at some level, you run until you feel you hit one of those blockages, and then you switch to one of the other projects. Now for me, this is different. Like now I basically run, I don't run any projects anymore. Someone comes in, hopefully they explain to me which project they work on in 5 minutes, and then I'm fully tuned in. And then at the end of the hour, like it weirdly gets mostly deleted out of my brain. But like for essentially my whole career, I had multiple projects, and that I switch once I hit a blockage.
I think how do you said you ended up being in like different fields like right before they took off. I'm just wondering how you happen to end up choosing those areas to work in.
Yeah, so one of them is I always asked a lot of people, and I still do. Like if I go to a conference, I'm like, okay, tell me how you feel about field X. And I ask that the leader in that field and other fields. And it's interesting because one person will say that's the best thing, and the other one says, look, they've run their course. This is dying, that field. But like this user network to answer that question. And I find people are surprisingly generous when you ask them like that, where you're like, you're an expert in that field. What do you think about that other field? What do you think are their potentials? Who are the young, great people? Now, every single person has a huge bias. So if you ask a random professor who the great people are, like, sure, his or her, like, trainees, duh. But once you do that with a few people, then you often find that they point at the same people that are rising stars, or like the same disciplines that are rising disciplines, and so that's, I guess, how I made my choices. But the other one is a lot of disciplines, if you really think through it, lack in logical substance. If you think about the discipline, you can often see that their main sales pitch doesn't work. And in that sense, that helps too.
So we have only a couple more minutes. I wanted to ask you, you've talked and given us wonderful impressions of how you, what things you found difficult or easy during your own career. What do you see as the main stumbling blocks for PhDs and postdocs around you, maybe that are different from those you experienced yourself?
I don't know. I think culture is a big one. You know, like if I see the trainees in my lab go to conferences, I see very different things. Some of them will basically be there working on making their connections, and some of them don't. And I try to then do interventions. I'm basically, hey, you, I want you to talk with that professor there right now. Come with me. I do those things. But like that is a big stumbling block, that at some level, if your default mode isn't to go and like talk with people, well, networking determines your success long term. So at some level, you need to have a process that allows you to do that. And that is different for different people. I've seen people that manage that very differently, that say, instead of like going and meeting people randomly, they like email very carefully, these are the people I want to talk with. But basically the network is a really important thing. The skill set is a really important thing. You know, like basically you need to know which skills you need to ultimately be successful at what you want to do. I think a big stumbling block is that people don't know their needed skill set. They're like, okay, I do this project, I do this right now. But if you're then, okay, to be who you want to be in 5 years, which skills do you need? A lot of people don't have an answer. You should always know which skills you want to have in 5 years that you don't currently have, always. And you should do your networking and your training and your reading according to that.
How do you find out what skills you'll need?
Okay, I find out which skills I need by talking with people, I guess. There's a bit of
that's not a bad...
there's a bit, but the other thing is that I'm trying to avoid being commoditized. Mm-hmm. So if my skill set is like that of a lot of other people, then, well, I better be the best person among those. I'm not generally the best person at anything. I personally can only be the best person at something if I'm the only person at that. And so therefore what I usually say is I like look at an area and I'm like, okay, that's what they do. What combination of skills, what kind of direction doesn't seem to be covered here? What can a discipline do for another discipline that hasn't currently been doing that? Mm-hmm. And so that's often what I look for in skill sets. But it's a lot of it is very soft skilly. But basically I spend time thinking about my skill set. I can tell you at any point of time, these are the things that I'm good at. These are the things that could be useful to be good at in the future. And these are the things that I'm bad with, and therefore let me cover that basis in some other way. You know, like, for example, like I hadn't done much math for a while. If you look at my lab, there's a whole bunch of very math-oriented people in the lab. I want to get better at that, and like I use that as a mechanism to fill my skill set. And I think like this basically, we spend thousands of hours on some arcane technique that we use. We should be using considerable time thinking about what exactly makes us us, what our skill set is.
That's great advice to take away. Think about the process and talk to people. Thank you, Konrad.